Okay. So the rabbit hole that I went down has more to do with the calendar. In other words, how long is a year? How long, how long is a month? I know we have calendars that actually calculate that, but someone had to come up with that idea. A calendar is by definition a mathematical process. And it's a long-term mathematical process that was created thousands of years ago. So the calendar that we have today was actually devised by, someone a couple thousand years ago. And the minutia of the calendar, like, the adding of a second or taking away a second, is only the result of is our ability to measure time has gotten more technologically advanced. Then they always do things like that. But in terms of Jewish perspective, it's it's a little weird. So in the Torah portion, in this week's Torah portion, it says that we should proclaim liberty throughout the land. This is the Torah portion that it comes from. And it's interesting when you look at it, there's some things that are actually missing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little something here. Oh, I want to just show you one thing here that I just have to get out I have to just get really quick here. And that is something in this week's Torah portion. All right, so let me get to. So to show you what I did is this is the Torah portion for this week, and it starts off, speak to, and God tells Moses on Sinai, speak to the Israelites. When you enter the land, I shall assign you. The land shall observe a Shabbat l'Adonai, a Sabbath for God. It's not a Sabbath of God; it's a Sabbath to God, essentially. So 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in your yield. So the first part of this talks about 6 years. Okay. But the seventh year you shall have a Sabbath, complete rest, Sabbath of God, shall not sow your field. I mean, this is the Shemitah year. You shall not, or the Jubilee year. You shall not reap after growth of the harvest, gather the grapes. In other words, you got to leave the land let the land completely rest, of course. You can eat whatever the land during the Sabbath will produce, and everyone that's with you. And then verse 6 goes, you shall count off 7 weeks of the year, 7 times 7 years. So the period of 7 weeks gives you a total of 49 years. And on the 50th year, you shall sound the loud horn in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, the day of the atonement. You shall have the horn sounded throughout your land. And shall hallow this 50th year. You shall proclaim release, which is the other translation is liberty. Most places translate the word as liberty. They're actually here. It actually the Sefaria translation, the new JPS translation, has it that they will release this your servants after all this time. But it's okay. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family, and so on and so forth. So here's the problem. If you're supposed to sound the shofar in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, on the Day of Atonement, and so that year is going to be a year of fallow. When does that year start? That's just, so that's actually, believe it or not, the question that some of us actually, that some of the commentators are asking. When does that year start? Because if you remember, in Judaism, there's 4 New Years. There's the New Year of Nisan, which is when Passover comes in. The first of Nisan is also the years when you become a king. That's when your reign starts. Like in our country, January 20th is the inauguration day. So essentially, that's when the president starts marking their first year, second year, so on and so forth in office. The first of Nisan was that during in Judaism. Then there's a couple others, and then there's, of course, Rosh Hashanah. But Rosh Hashanah starts the first day of Tishrei. of Tishrei. I'm sorry, starts the first day of Tishrei, not the 10th day. So why are we proclaiming this wonderful time on the 10th on this during the 7th month on the 10th day instead of on day one? So the problem is that when does this begin? And do we, if you go by a lunar year, your year is going to be very different than if you go by the solar year. So the question is how did they come up with this? So that's really it's really what we're going to kind of look at in a different way. So what I want to do in just a moment. That's what I need. I just have to go back over here. Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah. What we're dealing with here is the agricultural planting cycle, where you have to stop planting.
Well,
So
that may be true, but so when do you stop planting?
it would have to be the spring after you proclaim the year, rather than the spring before. It would have to be, I mean, Yom Kippur is in October generally. And you don't start planting in Israel probably until February. So it'd have to be that following February. You don't
Why
plant.
do you say we don't stop they start planting in February?
Well, it's a warm place. I mean, here we don't start planting until March or April or May, depending on what you're planting. But there it's warm, so you probably plant in February or late January. I don't know.
Actually, if you plant in February like January, you're not going to grow anything because you're planting right at the beginning of the rainy season of the rainy season.
So when in Israel do you start planting for the year?
That's the problem. You can see because also if you plant too late, you can't harvest anything in the 7th year, then that everything you plant in the middle of the 6th year, well, if you plant like in February or March, what you're talking about, it takes sometimes a full 6 months or so to harvest. So that means 6 months later from Nisan is Tishrei, and that's when they're going to proclaim the Jubilee year. So now you're stuck with all the stuff you planted in the springtime, and you can't touch it.
I'm talking about you do it during you would plant during the Jubilee year.
You can't plant during the Jubilee year.
Early. I mean, you would plant if you say Yom Kippur, and when is your planting season doesn't start in October.
Ellen, the point is you can't work the land during the Jubilee year
at all.
At all.
You can't plant.
Can't plant that thing.
Oh, okay. So that you can't work it that way.
But the things on the left-hand side of your screen now, this is what I sent you. On the right-hand side is everything with the footnotes. And it's the footnotes that really turn out to be kind of interesting. So this is Ibn Ezra is a Spanish commentator, and he quotes, for Ibn Ezra, it's a very long commentary because he quotes like little bits of everything. So we're going to kind of look at this, just give you an idea of what in the world he's looking for, or what he's looking at. So first of all, the part where it says, you shall make a proclamation with the blast of the horn. He starts out, there's a difference of opinion as to whether the world is created in Nisan or Tishrei. Now there is. In Rosh Hashanah, in the Talmud, there's actually an argument. Did the 7 days of creation, or 6 days of creation in Shabbat happen during Nisan or happen during Tishrei? And I will tell you, the ruling is actually that the world was created on Nisan, but because it says there's no need to dwell on this, for the transmitters of the law ordained that we are to say in the Rosh Hashanah prayer, which establishes this day marks the beginning of your works, is a memorial for the first day. So this is Hayom, right after the shofar blowing, there's a prayer on Rosh Hashanah. There's a prayer that says, now I can't think of it. I just blanked out on the Hebrew, but the whole prayer, it's basically this prayer that says that this is the birthday of the world, the beginning of the works. So because that's in the liturgy, according to Ibn Ezra, that's why we agree that the birthday of the world or the creation of the world happened on Rosh Hashanah. But he says that's the only reason we agree on that. He said, because it's still up for grabs. It says, we read in the scripture that the shofar is to be sounded in the Jubilee in the month of Tishrei at the beginning of the year. But it doesn't say at the beginning of the year, it says on the 10th day. Furthermore, the Torah, and he says, furthermore, so he's referring to in verse 9, He says, furthermore, the Torah and the portion commanding the people to hear the Torah read states that the Torah is to be read on the festival of Sukkot. So according to Ibn Ezra, the Torah says that the people gather, and that's what Shemini Atzeret, by the way, has to do with the last day of Sukkot, that everyone comes in and they start learning at the beginning of that year. That's the time that everyone's supposed to start actually learning. So that's the time they would actually learn again all the rules of the Jubilee year. Scriptures, right? They may hear that and that they may learn. So according to him, that this happens all the way during the Jubilee year, that everyone's supposed to kind of get together. But he says it's not possible for this to take place after a half year has passed. So the commentary, if Nisan is the beginning of the year when the public reading of the Torah initiates a mass study of the Torah, takes place 6 months after the start of the new year, according to Ibn Ezra, this makes no sense. For the study of Torah in the sabbatical year is similar to the study of the Torah on Shabbat, which means it's required to do. Now, the study of the Torah, the Shabbat, starts with the onset of Shabbat and doesn't start at midday. Similarly, the study of the Torah in the sabbatical year. Further, why waste half a year that could be devoted to Torah study? So, i.e., what he's actually trying to say is, you can't start this in Nisan in the springtime. It has to start in the fall time. Why? Because the Torah says that Sukkot is the time of everybody getting together. A little note here. Sukkot is the equivalent to the New York State Fair or the Big E, the Massachusetts State Fair. It's like a big party. And that's the greatest thing about this particular time period for Sukkot. That was the time that everyone used to get together. But he also says they start sowing in the month of Mar Cheshvan. Cheshvan is the month right after the high holidays. So this is when people actually start sowing, planting. And this is why people actually start planting, because that's also the beginning of the rainy season. Remember, in October, at the end of Sukkot, on Shemini Atzeret, we changed the liturgy from God who puts dew on the ground to God who brings rain to the thing. Mashif HaRuach U'Marid HaGashem. So the liturgy is going to change, dealing with bringing water. So all of a sudden now it's going to be this big rainy season. It's actually in late October, early November when people actually start planting. If the beginning of the year started in Nisan, then they would not harvest, which they sowed in the 6th year, and they would not be able to sow for it's a sabbatical year. If you plant it in Nisan, by the time it comes time for harvesting, you're in the Jubilee year and you can't touch it. And what that would mean then is essentially you'd go 2 years without having any food, because you can eat stuff that grows naturally in the Jubilee year, but you can't actually harvest like you would do a harvesting. You can kind of go and pick your own, your basic foods, or you just kind of store foods. However, Scripture says that they shall not sow in the 7th year alone. Now, this is where it kind of gets a little interesting. Judah HaParsi said that Israel employed a solar calendar. Yeah, who's Judah HaParsi? He's an early Karaite. If you know anything about Karaite Judaism, they take what the Torah says very literally. So if it says you shall not light a fire on Shabbat, they take it as Shabbat is a time period where you spend in total darkness. You cannot light a fire, you cannot cook food, nothing. You just kind of like sit there. That's what a Shabbat is as far as they're concerned. It's a very strict way of looking at it. Now, if this were so, that we don't know the exact time the year begins, Moses did not explain the length of a complete year, and so far the astronomers are unable to bring the length of a solar year to light. For example, sorry about that. For example, okay. For example, the wise men of India added a 5th hour to the quarter of the day. So what he's referring to is at this time period, everyone is trying to create a calendar that everyone can use. So in India, it said a solar year consists of 365 and a quarter days. The wise men of India added a 5th of an hour to this. So therefore, they claim the solar year consists of 365 and a quarter days plus a 5th of an hour. So it's like a little longer. It's a little longer than the way we had it. But Ptolemy and his friends said that 1/300th of the day is missing. So it's obviously, so they're talking about all the different types of things that could be missing that we're not getting it right. This is close to that of the intercalated calendar. Those who came after him said one part. Those who came after him said one part of 106, others said 110, 130, 180. These people are sitting there arguing, when does it really happen? For those who calculate the year when the sun concludes a cycle around the constellations from visible point. So in other words, people are saying, okay, well, maybe a year is when the sun goes, they're talking about, and remember, this is one time when they believe that the sun circled around the earth, when the sun actually went for a whole year. Others calculated from the point of the sphere, which inclines from the right to the left. So the sphere is the constellations. If you look up in the sky, especially in Israel, the Big Dipper is very widely is easy to see. You pick a constellation, you follow it from for a year's time, basically. You figure out how long it takes to get from this point all the way around to the same point here. So when they counted, they said it consisted of 365 days plus a little less than a quarter of the day. So we need, so Ibn Ezra actually puts down that we need what does he call it? He says we need tradition. That's to find it. In other words, what does the Torah talk about when it says a year? Because the Torah is not very clear on that. Furthermore, the meaning of the word Chodesh contradicts the Persian. So the word Chodesh doesn't mean month, it actually means new moon, according to Ibn Ezra. So we always based our calendar on when the new moon would actually come in, but does the new moon it says the new moon plays no role in establishing a solar year. The Sadducees say the Jewish religion is based on a lunar year. Okay, now here it's what he said. The Sadducees. He's talking about the Karaites, not the actual Sadducees that that were the priests. He's talking about specifically the Karaites. Says that the Jewish religion is based on a lunar year. No, there is no year at all to the moon. The moon doesn't have a year as compared to the sun, because you think about the phases of the moon goes through all the phases in 1 month. Whereas the sun, they say, comes with a different phase. The sun, though, has no months. So if the moon is based on the month, but the sun doesn't, it's not like there's a month that you can calculate that. So they figured what they were trying to do is the calculators, what they did is they created that it would take a year and it would be 12 moon months, or essentially 12 months that we have. In reality, it became a little different. Our months are therefore lunar months in our years, and our years return at the end of the solar year. Our sages there before transmitted to us a law given from Moses from Sinai, that the Beit Din always made 7 leap years in every cycle. So what he's talking about is the way that they, according to Ibn Ezra, through Moses and divinely passed down to generations. In matter of fact, we're talking about the 2nd century when Rabban Gamliel, he was the person in charge of creating a Jewish calendar, and that's why they're talking about. It says given to Moses from Sinai, and the Beit Din made 7 leap years in every cycle. So what that means is that out of 19 solar years, in years 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17, and 19, we add an extra month. And the reason why it was decided is that at the end of 19 years, the solar and lunars were equal. They figured at the end of this cycle that all of a sudden both the solar cycle and the lunar cycle were able to start again. I'm not going to go through the math of how they did that, but this is the reason why they came up with this whole thing. The secret of the cycle, he says, is known from the science of the stars. This was a radicalist statement that Ibn Ezra made, because keep in mind, he lives just, Ibn Ezra lived pretty much around the same time that around Galileo was around. And although he was in Spain, Galileo's in Italy, there's still a huge influence in science, because Ibn Ezra in Spain he's under the Ottoman control, and the Muslims and Jews all had some amazing astronomers. As a matter of fact, it's Arab culture that created a lot of astronomy, that what we do with astronomy today, but it was shared within the Jewish population. So science in Spain there was a lot of scientific research in Spain, whereas in Italy, where Galileo was, under the Catholic Church, science was like, you don't want to talk about it. Yes, Ellen.
The Jewish leap year, where we get an extra month, is every 2 or 3 years. It's not very even, is it?
No, it's 7 times in a 19-year cycle. 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17, 19.
I mean, our English calendar is every 4 years we get an extra month. How does this work out that we get an extra month every 2 or 3 years? I mean,
Keep
does
in
it
mind
work?
that so come out of this for a second. The a lunar month, a month is about 29 days. So, if you go from the moon phases, from the new moon to a new moon, it's about 29 days, roughly. Sometimes a little less, sometimes, never a little less. It's never less, but it's always it could be 29, it could be 30 days. So it depends on the month. But there's only basically like 11 months in a lunar year, according to all the calculations. So we have to add another month and keep in mind, if our months are 29 days, basically, and a solar month, January, February, March, April, are 30 to 31 days.
You're getting a lot of extra
Yeah,
days
we have a
there.
lot of extra days. And if they didn't do the calculations right, Passover, which is a spring holiday, could come in the middle of the summer. Sukkot, which is a fall harvest holiday, could end up coming in December and January. They don't do it. That's why Ramadan, for example, in Islam, comes at a different time of year because it's based solely on the lunar calendar, and it changes in the secular calendar, in our calendar, it's going to change every year.
Yeah,
Whereas
well, our holidays do, especially when there's a
no,
leap year.
our holidays don't change. They're at the same time every year on the lunar calendar, not the solar calendar. The only holiday that has an exception is Purim, because Purim only comes out through the second Adar, not the first Adar. So the Adar is the extra month that's added. So we have Adar 1 and Adar 2, and Purim is celebrated on Adar 2. Now, some
Okay.
people actually celebrate it twice, but that's just because it's a fun holiday.
But there's a lot more adjusting.
Well, there
In,
has to be. I mean, that's right. Like Hanukkah a couple of years ago, and it'll happen again in a few years, will happen on Thanksgiving. And only
it
because
comes really early then. I mean, compared to the English calendar.
exactly. So it
Yeah.
looks like, compared to the solar calendar, it comes early. It's just, but in the lunar calendar, Hanukkah is going to come on the 25th day of Kislev. But they have to add that extra month, so it kind of makes it up for the following year. So this year, like Rosh Hashanah is the end of September, which is what people consider to be somewhat normal.
Yeah.
Instead of like last year, it came like right after Labor Day.
That was about that seemed early. It did seem very early.
It does, and some days it doesn't come till October. Some days Rosh Hashanah doesn't come till October, which means Sukkot comes at the end of October. Which also means that what's good about that, it means Hanukkah comes around Christmas. And I know I'd always much rather have Hanukkah come at Christmas because we have 8 days, so we have the option of going to after, we're going to buy gifts during the Christmas sales, the after Christmas sale. So
Yeah, but what about the planting? That must be very hard as to when you can't plant for a whole year.
well, you planted, didn't know you plant after Sukkot. You begin planting again after Sukkot.
The
Um,
next year.
and then that's the spring harvest. In the springtime, you can plant for the fall harvest, but you've got to figure that you have to be able to harvest it before Rosh Hashanah. So you're actually harvesting like in August or early September instead of September, October, which is a problem for some plants. For example, you can't start if you think about upstate New York, your apples can start coming out, but if you start harvesting them too early, they're not
They're
going to
not
be
ripe.
they're not going to be ripe, and they're not going to ripen off the tree either. So you've got to like time it perfectly. Now there are a lot of loopholes, obviously, in all this, but interesting how Ibn Ezra is like going through this whole thing about how do we know when it's a year? Because if you're going to follow Judaism to the letter, so to speak, you need to be able to be specifically like in Jerusalem, which I'm looking forward to hearing in the summer when I get there in the summer. 18 minutes before sunset in Jerusalem, there's a siren that goes off, which tells you that's the time to light candles. I just think that's to me that is so cool. I mean, all of a sudden you don't have to, not looking at your watch or what, it's just it's like this is the time to start doing it. It's only in Jerusalem, by the way. I don't know if they do it all in Israel, but I know they do it in Jerusalem. So it's kind of like
and it's different from the siren that says go to your fallout shelter.
well, yeah, apparently it's going to
That's
sound
a different siren. That's really terrible. They're still having that all the time.
I guess I'll have to. I'll eventually have to learn the difference between the two, but somehow I think I'll find out pretty quickly. But so anyway, so that's part of the. That's kind of thinking when you talk about proclaiming liberty, when do you do it? And the fact that the shofar itself is announce it on Yom Kippur, does that not mean that the year actually starts on Rosh Hashanah 10 days before? So that's kind of what Ibn Ezra was saying, that it's at that first day of Tishrei where the year actually starts. Instead, it's not, you may not blow it till Yom Kippur, but you actually start that time, and based on the calendar, and people have it marked on of what that happens, what that time period is that we actually start on Nisan. So that's kind of like how they did that in terms of developing and why they had to develop the calendar the way they did. Ibn Ezra is a grammarian. He's not a mathematician. His explanation, that's why there's a lot of footnotes in his commentary in terms of how he came up with how he would describe it, because he couldn't explain it mathematically. And if you're ever interested, we can all sit down together and I can give you a mathematical treatise on how calendars created, but believe me, it's very boring. So yes, Bob, if you're interested, I'll be happy to sit down with you on that, but it's not it's not something I would actually do. So that was just a little bit of thing. The other part of that, I know it turned out to be much longer than I thought. The other part of it is we're supposed to proclaim liberty throughout the land. Is it the same law for men and women? We know that both men and women's servants and slaves are freed. That during this Jubilee year, but do men have the same requirements, or do women have the same requirements as men for the Jubilee year? Because all it says is proclaim liberty throughout the land for you. Doesn't say that you mean both male and female. And believe it or not, that's what the whole other thing is. Actually talks about how the males were more honored than females throughout Judaism. And it goes on and on and on and on. But he finally concludes that nope, actually they're both the same. So I mean, but it's interesting how if you follow the commentaries, how the Midrash gets from one thing to another. So that's all I did, folks. That's what
I've said a lot of research.
We're not going to be able to meet next week because I'm going to be out of town on Monday for Memorial Day. And I will be immersed in another type of learning, which essentially is baseball, because I'm just going to Cooperstown to hang out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arnie.
You're very
Thank you
welcome.
very much. Thank you. Very nice.
All right. So I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Okay.
All
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.